So I've been sitting in the back of the room listening very intently to the dialogue, kind of going back and forth, and having some moments of reminiscence. When Ronnie Borker talked about the Altair 8800, anybody else in the room actually use that computer? We need to talk. So did I. I think it was 4K of memory, if I remember correctly, if you got the large memory model. And I think about 3.8 of it was the operating system. You had to load that from a tape because there was no other way to get the information in. Everything was basically modulated. So the output went to an RF modulator and you connected it to a television. There was no monitor. Am I making this up, right? So a little bit painful. And even at that time, it was high tech. I remember burning my own EEPROMs, writing my own code for industrial stuff. You can't do any of that anymore. Everything's too complicated now. It's all your fault, by the way. So I have a nephew. I promise I'll get to the presentation. I have a nephew who is an engineer. He's one generation older than me. And we were having a conversation in the car not too long ago, driving along. He's very smart. He took calculus. He's a smart guy. And I was having a version of this conversation with him about how quickly things are changing. And I said, well, for example, you don't care about how your technology works. He said, of course I care, I'm an engineer. And I said, do you know how to calculate a square root? And he thought about it and he said, well, there must be some kind of transcendental function. I said, no, it's a process. Do you know how to do it? And he said, well, there's a square root button on my calculator. And I said, what if you don't have your calculator? And he said, my phone has a calculator, my calculator is a calculator, everything has a calculator. So I got frustrated. I should have stopped. The number one rule when you're in a hole is stop digging. But I said to him, well, what if you're on a desert island and you don't have your calculator? He said, why do I need a square root? He doesn't care. And I think that the sort of the blessing and the curse of what you will do is, for those who are not in this industry, it's just the magic inside the box that makes the stuff work, and it always gets faster, and it always gets better, and there's always more of it than we need. And I know none of that is true. I know all of that comes with great pain. The same thing is true in general about the computer industry. In the Altair 8800 days, actually the 8800B if you want to be particular, and it was named after a planet on Star Trek, by the way. Most people don't know that, the planet Altair. Computers, they didn't even look like that yet, but we understood how information was stored, where it was stored, how it was created. We understood the way people used information. These are people sitting in a train, and they're sort of reading about people that aren't there, and they're reading about things that happened yesterday, and they're consuming information. Today, it looks something like this, and to put it in color, okay, but we don't really know what's going on. This guy might be texting this guy about her, right? She might be at work creating some kind of content. This person might be either creating or consuming content. And it's all stored somewhere in the cloud, and none of us think there's actual hard drives floating around in the cloud. They're data centers with flexible storage, and they exist somewhere. And the places where they exist, there's laws, there's rules about data sovereignty and cross-border data transfer and all that stuff, and we don't have to worry about it. It just happens. Well, it doesn't just happen. So the complexity of making all of this magic happen, not only in your world, but in sort of the broader world that you serve, is getting to a point where it's hard to describe. Headwinds, tailwinds, depends on where you are, but the idea that on one side, we have vectors that influence the other side. So for example, data creation and data curation, bringing data in and storing it someplace where we can find it again when we need it. Well, this whole Moore's Law thing is out the window for data. All of those articles you read about how much data there is on Earth, they're all kind of measuring a particular place, like the internet or maybe the amount of storage space that's being created, but they're all proxies for how much information there is, because there's edge, there's information that's destroyed as it's created, there's stream data. All of this is very hard to measure. I would submit that the amount of data that's being created is increasing at a rate which is itself unmeasurable right now. In other words, not only don't we know how much information we have as a human race, we've lost the ability to measure how fast it's increasing. That is both promising and terrifying. If you go into any sufficiently large corpus of information with a preconceived notion, you will find proof that you're right. Doesn't mean you're right. About 4% of the internet is searchable. What about the other 96% that sits behind a password or a firewall, or it's encrypted, or it's underneath some kind of a drop-down? Well, none of that's searchable, and yet how many people derive what they call research from doing a search in a search engine? I'm not saying search engines are bad. I'm saying that that is necessary but not sufficient. On the other side of this equation, we've got silos that continue to proliferate in organizations, in countries. We've got information that you can only get at if you're over there, not over here. We've got information that only makes sense in that context or this context. People ask me all the time, could you compare the AI in China to the AI in the United States, or pick any other two countries, it doesn't matter. And my answer is kind of, I can, but we have different objective functions. We're not really trying to achieve the same thing. So don't judge what I say as either good or bad or faster or slower in a context of where you sit, unless you understand where the other side sits. Since we're in Europe, I'll use an example. Privacy is pretty important in Europe. Privacy is even more important, arguably, in Germany. We also want devices to be customized. Well, those are kind of opposites. I said that before. So how do you manage that? Well, first thing you do is you manage it by recognizing that it exists. And then you have to deal with it. The regulators have to figure out how to strike a balance there. We talked about that a lot before. There's definitely a skills gap. Has nothing to do with knowing how to calculate a square root, but it has to do with sort of accepting that everything that's in this open source library that I pulled down will do what it says it will do as documented, and I don't necessarily need to understand how it works. Well, you might need to know how it works to understand something that hasn't been thought about before, and that's the essence of empirical research. That's the essence of moving forward. One of the things that we look for in my group is something we call malfeasance, the bad behavior that precedes a crime. So it's not really a fraud yet when people lie to Dun & Bradstreet. Well, guess what? If you want to look at finding bad guys, there's an observer effect. The best bad guys, when they think they're being observed, they change their behavior. So if you model how they're behaving and learn from their behavior, you're learning how the best ones are no longer behaving. Whoops. Going to need a new kind of algorithm for that. We have one. It's called temporal anisotropic regions. I promise not to describe it. So this quote from William Gibson is awesome. The future is already here. It's just not very evenly distributed. Don't assume that somebody over there has more than you have over here. They probably do. You probably have more of something than they do. And the answer we need to do some of these new problems is probably somewhere in between. These are just random articles. The things on your right, these are not the 9 ethical issues. I wrote my own list of what I thought were ethical issues, and then I looked for some articles and made sure that they all talked about the same things I did. And I just think out loud on PowerPoint slides sometimes because I'm weird. But the dialogue, and we've heard some of these things today. Actually, we've probably heard all of them. We've talked about my job's going to be replaced by a computer. Well, no, it's not. But is your job going to be different? You bet. Raise your hand if you want to report to a robot someday. Nobody's raising your hand. Raise your hand if Outlook tells you to go to a meeting and you go. You're already reporting to a robot. You're just not thinking about it that way, right? Data rights, the creation of information versus who gets value from the curation of that information. If you take nothing else away from what I'm saying so far, creation versus curation, making the data and putting it someplace where you can find it when you need it. Those are becoming increasingly challenging things on both ends of that spectrum. So if there's data about me pacing up and down the stage here that's being stored on my fitness monitor, which is, by the way, not monitoring my fitness, it's monitoring my health. I may or may not be fit. That's an issue I have with terminology. This data belongs to me. At least I feel that way. Now, the device manufacturer may say, well, no, because without the accelerometer and the algorithms that are built into that device, you wouldn't know how many steps you took. I can count to 10, but there was a bunch of researchers that recently contracted to get data from fitness monitors to see who woke up from an earthquake, to see whether or not they could wake up enough people to notify the rest of the people that are still sleeping when an earthquake happened. I didn't know I was participating in that research. Apparently I was, right? some people feel like I ought to get compensated for that. There's whole boards called IRB that do things like that. This last one, explainability, is increasingly problematic. We don't have a lot of time, but if I asked someone here to name 5 red things, just think about red things for a second. Anybody here think about a stop sign? Show of hands. Did anybody here think about a clown's nose? Did anybody here think about a flower? Lipstick? A balloon? Okay, you have to take my word for it. Except for the balloon, one hand went up on every example I gave. What about a lemon? Is that red? No. What about a bowling ball? Maybe, but not usually, right? What you did was you wrote a computer program on the fly in the neuromorphic environment of your brain. You don't know what you did, and then you used it for regression testing, and then you used it for negative regression testing, and it worked just fine. Now tell me what you did. You have no idea what you did. And anything you try to do right now to explain what you did is rationalizing what you think you did, but not what you actually did. And yet, we want these algorithms that are sometimes done with ensemble methods, multiple methods competing to get the best possible answer, cognitive solutions. We somehow want, the world is moving in a direction to say everything needs to be explainable after the fact. I'm not sure that's ever realistic. I understand why we want that, because people feel aggrieved, they feel marginalized, they're worrying about bias. I get it, but we need to think about this question and not just put a stake in the ground, or we could create a stake of sort of thwarted innovation, and any place where that stake isn't in the ground, you'll have a discontinuity. Something to think about. I don't have the answer. By the way, the bad guys are thinking about using all this AI too. I do a lot of work with people who worry about stuff like this, and the types of attacks are getting smarter and smarter. There are, I'm sure, people in this room that are experts in this field. There are types of malware that work like the AIDS virus. They're recombinant. They change every time they attack your system. So you can't just use a signature file to see, oh, that's a bad thing, I know about that, because the next time you see it, it looks differently. In my group, we look at flocking and swarming algorithms. We don't have time, but a flock is something that can bifurcate and a swarm coalesces, but they do sort of things that involve, the anthill example this morning, or I think it was anthill, good example of that. There are algorithms that have been around for a long time to do that. Well, what happens when the bad guys use flocking and swarming algorithms to learn from how their malware failed, report back to the hive consciousness, and change the behavior, because there is a queen, change the behavior of that swarm or flock, and have it repopulate with the birds and the bees. By the way, that's already happening. This is really scary. We don't know how to deal with the first kind of malware yet completely, and now we've got this new kind of malware that behaves like cancer, that behaves like AIDS. Really, really scary stuff. Deep Blocker basically targets an individual or an environment and uses convolutional networks, all that cool technology that tells a self-driving car what a stop sign looks like, to say whether or not that's the target of the malware. And if not, just keep infecting until you find the person that you're going after or the environment that you're going after. Terrifying stuff. So guess what happens if, let's assume everybody in this room is a good guy, and I assume we are. Guess what happens if you go back and do the same thing you were doing yesterday? If we're getting further behind, and you do the same thing you did yesterday, it stands to reason we will get further behind at an increasing rate. That's called a red queen problem, and we are living in one. The cost of doing nothing is not nothing. The cost of doing nothing is getting further behind. So one of the things I do is I pull up these things. You can find articles and reviews like this all the time, and they're on the internet, so they must be true, right? 10 technology trends in 2018. It's a good study, PwC study. And I look at something like this and I say, all right, deep learning, reinforcement learning, explainable AI, digital twins. I know what all those are, and we're either doing them or not doing them on purpose. And then I see capsule networks. And the first time I saw this, I said, I don't know what that is. You got to tell the truth. You got to be able to say those words out loud. I don't know what that is. It's only 6 words. And then go learn what it is. So one of the challenges that I give to myself is to try to do this at least once a month, at least once every couple of weeks. Honestly, it's at least once a week, but I don't want to tell the truth. Look Find something you don't know about, chase that rabbit down a hole just far enough so that you know what it looks like when you see it again. And that way, if you're not doing something, you're not doing it on purpose. So the number one rule of innovation is make new mistakes every day. Don't make the same ones you made yesterday. The only way to do that is to be always learning, to be always looking for new opportunities like that. These are some examples of some of the work that we do. This is not a commercial, but by way of example so that you don't think I just talk about stuff. We use something called progressive decomposition and propositional calculus. We have to work with a lot of people that don't speak the same language. You'd have a real ball if you listened in on some of our conference calls because they might be in 3 or 4 different languages. Everybody speaks English at some level, most people. But sometimes we have to reduce the problem to symbols in order to be able to have a deep, complicated conversation because the words get in the way. And so the thing we were working on here was 3 mutually exclusive scenarios around, don't touch the microphone, 3 mutually exclusive scenarios around hurricanes. And the 3 scenarios were there will be a category 4 or 5 hurricane. They call it hurricane season for a reason. Maybe there'll be there'll be a hurricane, but it'll be less than category 4. Or there'll be no hurricane. Those are 3 mutually exclusive scenarios. And then we articulate an axiom, something we're not going to test. So in this case, the axiom was, if there's a category 4 or 5, the federal government will come in and pour lots of money in there to help remediate the area. And where there's lots more money, there's lots more fraud. We're not going to test that. We're going to work with that assumption. And then we start and we do anomaly detection. And you can see here what's happening at time 1, time 2, and time now. I don't know why they oriented it this way, but just let it go. So we establish some sort of a baseline. We pitch it out in front of us into the beginning of hurricane season and then at some other point in hurricane season. And what you see forming here, so the region here and here is relatively the same, but what forms is this lumpy part. And by adding increasing types of data and increasing methods, the lumpy part becomes more and more visible. We're sort of adding our focus on it. That thing is what's called an anisotropic region. It's irregularly irregular. We zoom in on that. We let a bunch of smart people that are experts in fraud detection help, and we get something called an augmented AI approach. In other words, let the AI take you as far as it can and point you in a direction that you couldn't possibly have looked because there's so much noise. We're not looking for needles in haystacks, we're looking for needles in stacks of needles. Everything has value. The question is whether we can use it for the inquiry that we're going about. So in this case, we start with certain truths, we make assumptions, we look for observations about the anomalies, and then we kind of repeat. Now, if anybody out there is an expert in AI, you're going to say, well, that's a Bayesian approach. It's not really a Bayesian approach because we cheat. We add a lot of expertise along the way. We change the rules. Notice we change the amount of data we're looking at. We change the types of data we're looking at. We change the methods that we're using. Because we're allowing people to pull the strings here, we can do that. If you were trying to use a pure AI method that you pulled out of your open source toolkit, you couldn't do that because it would create too much error. And the error would overwhelm the predictive ability of the system. So this is what it looks like to look for something that's changing while you're looking at it. This is another example. And here, I won't go into how we found it, but we found this clique, this group of 11 or so red dots that were hiding in about 54 million dots. And I don't know how many millions upon millions of connections. And the interesting thing about these red dots, the regularly irregular thing, is they only do business with the party that we were serving and one other party. That's weird. That's either money laundering or fraud or identity theft or something like that. I don't know what it is. It looks like a duck, it walks like a duck, it's probably a duck. So we take these 11 entities and we give them to some really smart, scary people that are certified fraud examiners and we say, go figure it out. Maybe it's some new type of business we don't understand. That's fine. If it is, we'll change the anomaly detection to be able to recognize that new kind of business and it won't show up as irregular anymore. The fundamental premise here is to push the definitions. So anomaly detection, when you read about it in a textbook, is looking for things that are different than regression, different than what you already understand. And anything that's outside of a certain number of standard deviations is assumed to be random variation. We start from the premise that it's not all random, that there's sneaky bad guys out there. And it's amazing what you can find when you change the definitions. So the one thing that's good about science is you get to change the definitions as long as you're being empirical about it, as long as you're being careful about definitions. That's the essence of what we're doing. So now to bring this up to like normal level again, what I would suggest to you is everything you're doing, I was just trying to demonstrate to you how the science of data science is being disrupted. Well, everything's being disrupted. And the whole point of what I'm saying is everything that you can point to is being disrupted by this hypergeometric growth of data and this massive change in the capabilities of AI that we've been talking about all day. So this is an example from the perspective of blockchain and quantum computing, right? Quantum computing and blockchain are two sort of emerging technologies that are actually disrupting each other, because quantum computing has the ability to disrupt the way RSA keys work, the way encryption works. And blockchain relies on encryption. So what do we do about that? Well, the answer is, I don't know yet. I'll let you know when it's done cooking. It's still happening. Watching these things happen, this convergence of disruption is unique to our generation. The second generation of digital natives is now alive. Digital natives that were born to digital natives. When I used that 8800 computer, I was a digital immigrant. I was born into an industry that didn't have computers. I'm as old as the commercial computer industry by about 2 years. Actually, the other way around, but it doesn't matter. I know, I'm a dork. Okay, so that's not true anymore. Everyone that's born today, and most of the people in this room grew up with an internet, or you at least have kids that grew up with the internet. How does it change the way we think about stuff like this? Do we care how it's being disrupted? Will we only care after it's too late? Why do people ask rhetorical questions? So, I promise, I'm almost done. Thank you for getting that. I do Kung Fu, I do martial arts. And one of the things they teach you in martial arts is that you only have 2 feet. So if you're gonna lean over here, I didn't even think about this. If you can't see in the back, but my right foot is pointing that way. The reason that I subconsciously do that is if I lean over here, I might have to suddenly change my focus over here. Notice I didn't have to move my feet, right? The essence of being in a disrupted environment is to be very careful about where you put your feet. Don't lean too far over into one thing. If all you're focusing on is the Internet of Things, which, by the way, is not really an Internet of Things right now, it's an Internet of Things connected to the Internet. As they start to get more autonomous and more disconnected, now we have to really worry about what happens because all the data doesn't live back. That was the conversation before about the edge. If I lean too far over there, I fall over and I stop thinking about language. I stop thinking about how AI is changing or data technology itself. And then those other forces that are coming in orthogonally to everything, cyber everything, geopolitical, regulatory change, workforce, those aren't technologies at all. Those are human behavioral changes. All of this change is happening at once. If you try to focus on it all at once, you fall over because you only have 2 feet. But you have to be careful where you put them, and you have to put them where you put them on purpose. This is pretty much the end of what I have to say here. I would encourage you to think about the myths and the realities of what we hear. So we're hearing, the AI will take over everything. Well, if we let it, some really smart people, Stephen Hawking was saying pretty much that, right? I'm saying we get to pick, or at least we get to slow it down, or at least we get to have some say in it. AI will augment decision making. The more we allow AI to make decisions for us, the less we will care about how to calculate the square root. Maybe that doesn't matter. But my example with anomaly detection, I hope I showed you that understanding how anomaly detection works, you can do something that otherwise would be thought to be impossible. So we get to pick. The emerging technologies, if you could read this, which you probably can't in the back, but you'll have access to the slides, cognitive computing, virtual reality, augmented reality, blockchain, you've heard of every single buzzword on here because it's what you're enabling. None of those things would be possible without the impossible that you're all doing. So the challenge that I have as we think about how this moves into the future and what kind of new realities, that smart cities, owning, accessing the data, the changing relationship of work, an aging population that the 120-year-old person is already alive, all of those things are enabled by the new technology or the most horrible, unthinkable cyber issues, blowing up, data, all of it, we get to pick. We get to pick. It's a tough card to draw, but we drew it. This is the generation, the working generation right now is the ones that get to set the direction of that vector. Fantastic quote here from Dennis Waitley. We have to look within for value, but beyond for perspective. Thank you very much.